there's, like all these kooky sports that are out there. Obviously it's not going to be what it was where you had thousands of people in a fronton, but I think that there's enough interest that it would be, like an alternative sport that people would watch.
Welcome to Forum, Beyond the Pages, the podcast that tells the stories behind the stories of Florida Humanities award-winning magazine. I'm Andrew Quintana. It's game on in this newest season as we speak to the writers who penned the articles in our spring 2024 sports issue of Forum. This week, writer Francisco Alvarado on his article, One More Serve. Inside Miami's Magic City Casino, a revival is brewing. A sport once as synonymous with Florida as palm trees is clawing its way back into relevance. The World Alai League is what remains of a historic sport that can trace its roots to the Basque region of Spain and France more than 4 centuries ago. To play alai, 2 players must stand in a walled-in space known as a fronton. The players must use a handheld wicker basket, commonly referred to as a cesta, to bounce a racquetball against the concrete walls. The player serving the ball against the front wall scores a point when the opponent doesn't catch the rebound and the ball touches the floor more than once. The rules are simple, but as Alvarado's story points out, the sport's legacy in Florida is anything but simple. So I want to be really honest at first. For weeks, I was telling people I was doing an interview on a story about Jai alai. And I just told everyone kept giving me a weird look when I said it. And it took so long before someone actually corrected me. It was like, no, it's highlight. And I say that to kind of illustrate the point that a lot of people my age have never heard of this sport because it was my friends I was saying that to. Mm-hmm. How did you come across this topic and pitch it to Forum?
Well, the reason I came across this topic was actually Pam Daniels reached out to me and said, hey, we're doing this sports issue and we really want to touch on alai and the history of alai. And I jumped on it because I came to Miami in 1980. So that was like right at the height of alai. So I grew up with alai in the sense of like that it was, part of the milieu of Miami. And I remember, every time we would drive by to the airport, right off the highway was Miami Alai, the premier fronton in all of Florida and even the country. People would call it the Yankee Stadium of alai. So I thought I was the right fit to write this story just because I was so familiar with it from my childhood.
Yeah, it's funny to see that it wound up in Miami and across the country because it has this really unique history that started really in Spain and France you write about. Can you tell me how it found its way all the way to South Florida and even other parts of the country?
So alai is a sport that goes back way like centuries, like in the Basque region of Spain and France. When they started coming over to the New World, they brought the sport with them. And it first spread in South America, then the Caribbean. By the 1900s, it finally made it to the United States at the World Fair in St. Louis. They had the first game there and the first fronton. It just kind of like, was a natural, I think, for Florida, especially South Florida, because, the subtropical climate.
It's funny because today when you drive around Florida, you'll see basketball courts, you'll see tennis courts, you'll see baseball fields, but you don't really see frontons anywhere. When the sport was alive and thriving in South Florida, where would you have gone to train for this?
So yeah, that's one of the odd things about alai is that there wasn't like racquetball courts. You see handball courts, but you never saw a alai court because it's so involved. You have to wear the cesta, you have to put on the helmet. It wasn't like a practical recreational sport. They had to actually go to a facility that was built for alai.
I really liked Benny Bueno's character in the story. I felt like he reminded me of those old-time boxing coaches from like pulp magazines where he used to be real big and he's still clinging on to the sport years later. I kind of liked how his story evolved. Did he ever give you insight about what life was like as a highlight player at its height, at its peak?
Yeah, Benny is definitely one of those like old school type characters. He just kind of like gave me the the sense of like the vibe of walking into Miami Alai, the fronton that was considered the Yankee Stadium of alai. He would walk in there and then just the energy of like 10,000 people rooting for him, because like, you know, it was an enclosed space, so you could really feel the emotion and the drama that these people would come, because they're all betting on these players. So it's like, you know, you're not just coming to see the player, you know, you're actually wagering on the player. So, you know, you have a lot of faith. You're putting a lot of faith in these guys. You know, he said, you know, it was kind of like overwhelming at first. He was like, I think he was like 17 or 18 when he started playing professionally. You know, he walks into this like, you know, cavernous, you know, this enclosed cavernous place, and it's just like all these, you know, highlight fans, and you know, just like rowdiness, and there's gambling, there's, you know, there's booze flowing.
The good times didn't last forever. Obviously, as we know now, there were many kind of black eyes to Highlight's reputation over the years, and that brought it down. But the biggest one that you point out is the corruption with the game. A lot of games were becoming rigged and predetermined before they were even played. Why was the sport so susceptible to that level of corruption?
Well, I think the sport was susceptible to organized crime and that type of corruption, just because, again, it was a pari-mutuel sport where gambling's involved. And, you know, when there's gambling, I mean, your organized crime is going to be there. And that's the unfortunate thing with alai. And one of the main reasons why it was never taken seriously as a sport as you would take seriously, like, you know, tennis or, you know, football or basketball, because it always had this element, that the element of gambling. And they went together. I mean, you know, like you couldn't have alai without the gambling, because that's what made the sport more enticing for people. The fact that you could wager on a player. So obviously, you know, organized crime's involved, and they want to, like, you know, take advantage of that. The more people bet on something, the more money you're going to make. So that's what happened. You had a lot of organized crime figures, you know, infiltrating the sport. In the story, I mentioned this group called the Miami Syndicate, which was fixing games in Connecticut, which was another state that had high alai. And it was a whole, you know, like it was a whole ring of people, and that involved players too. Florida regulators were also like investigating frontons and, you know, going through their financial records, trying to, like, you know, find traces to organized crime. So I mean, like, so high alai never was able to, I guess, you know, remove that stigma of having, you know, some connections to organized crime.
Was that the biggest issue with the sport that caused its downfall, or it kind of seemed like there was a snowball effect from there, right?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, you could say it was a snowball effect of different things that were happening in Florida. Aside from, like, the, you know, the negative press of organized crime, you also had the introduction of the Florida lottery in the 1980s, which gave people another way to, like, the wager. And then you had the issue of the players' strike, where the players were, you know, trying to demand, you know, some more concessions from the owners. And then Florida just, you know, there was more sports. You know, by the end of the 80s, we had the Miami Heat, we had the Orlando Magic basketball teams. And then, you know, we started having professional baseball teams like the Florida Marlins, and then, you know, finally hockey, you know, with the Florida Panthers and the Tampa Bay Lightning. So people had more options to, I guess, you know, for their sports fix. You know, back in the day and during the 80s, I mean, all we had was the Miami Dolphins. So High Alai only had to compete with the Miami Dolphins. So this was a maelstrom of events that just kind of did High Alai in. I think Benny Bueno told me that, you know, at the height of his career, there were like a dozen or more than a dozen frontons. And then by the early 2000s, there was only 3 left: Dania Beach, Ocala, and Miami.
Your story starts and ends with this current revival of highlight, or at least this attempt to revive the sport. The sport never really went away, obviously. You still mention players and champions throughout the 2000s, but there seems to be a renewed push nowadays to really get it to that old 80s popularity. Mm-hmm. What makes this current promotion of the league, this current revival, different?
I think what makes this current revival different for High Alai is that it's trying to be a little more edgy and a little more attuned to, like, Gen Z. They try to, like, switch things up. I mean, it's not like, you know, that it's still a traditional game of High Alai. They do, like, these different kinds of matches, and they make it, like, more interesting, as opposed, like, they make it more about teams versus each other, and, like, they're all playing for a championship as opposed to, like, you know, individual players. The World High Alai League is also trying to bring in celebrities to sponsor these teams. They brought in Pitbull. They brought in Udonis Haslem, who's the, you know, former Miami Heat player. One thing about the World High Alai League that's really interesting that I found that seems to be working as far as, like, creating an online following for High Alai, not so much, you know, people in the stands. So I think from that standpoint, it's different in that sense that they're just kind of like trying to create a cult following, I think, almost. it seems hard that they're going to be able to get back to that day where they have like 10,000 people in the stands. I think it's more about like, again, creating a buzz.
Do you think there's still a place for alai in the current sports landscape?
Well, I think so. Yeah. I mean, like, just like how there's racquetball, there's racquetball leagues, there's frisbee leagues, there's, like all these kooky sports that are out there. Obviously it's not going to be what it was where you had thousands of people in a fronton, but I think that there's enough interest that it would be, again, just kind of like an alternative sport that people watch. One other thing about the World Highlight League is that they did have they got a broadcasting deal with, I think it was ESPN3, again, lower tier network, but they're still on TV. And I think that's where it'll have a space. But I don't think it's going to be like something where it'll evolve beyond the novelty.
That was Francisco Alvarado on his story, One More Serve. Forum, Beyond the Pages, is produced by Florida Humanities. Our music was created by Tampa Bay area musician JJ Padishall. You can follow him on Instagram at JJ Padishall Music. Want to get the latest issue of Forum delivered to your door 3 times a year? Become a Florida Humanities member by visiting floridahumanities.org/membership. Until next time.